Hello, boys and girls, and welcome back. I am not the nation's leading infectious disease control expert. However, at a recent candidate forum in Northern Virginia that I had the privilege and opportunity to attend in a safe online forum, an introductory lesson to basic concepts in civics was found to be useful for that audience to better inform them about their role in fulfilling their duties as responsible adults, citizens, and especially for those involved in medical practice. I have recently been reminded by many public health professionals of the necessity to test sincerity of those engaged in their duties and responsibilities, especially in a public health crisis. And I just want to thank personally the Arlington NAACP for that most informative affair. So with this in mind, this instructional video will enable you to check your facts, and what better way to introduce the topic of infectious disease control than to use familiar examples rather than to attempt to introduce totally new concepts and terms that just may add to more confusion. So for the next few moments, we shall attempt to familiarize viewers with the concepts of infectious disease control using the example of pregnancy and sexual intercourse, with which most of you should have some familiarity, to better understand your role in the prevention of spreading deadly disease, particularly during this time of great public health crisis. So please sit back, relax, and if you so require, feel free to take notes. In fact, I encourage you to take notes as we present our latest production, Look, My Mom's Having a Novel Coronavirus. If you have been, dare I say, religiously, boys and girls, following this video series, since the word scientifically simply does not exactly capture the idea, you know that we began by presenting a comparative analysis between infectious disease in the current public health crisis with something with which at least most adults should share some familiarity, if only an aspiration. Even if unplanned pregnancies continue to be problematic for some who are like that fellow with the rental car who always needs to purchase the insurance and can't figure out why. And while there have been a long line of cases on the topic of abortion, with a cluster of significant cases intriguingly finding a genesis in the state of Texas, forming an outbreak cluster, as it were, and even today, we find abortion decisions continuing to make national headlines. We made the decision to return to the origins by relating these facts to the decision of the United States Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade that was decided back in 1973. In part because due to a common misconception, regardless, an alleged right of a woman to choose that has been associated with this opinion written by Justice Harry Andrew Blackmun, because these words at no time ever appear in the decision to be understood in that manner, even if that is the way that it goes in some heads, perhaps thinking about something else, who even without reading the case and are yet convinced that they know the facts, which in a public health crisis can be quite dangerous. Do not look at anything to read what you want to see, but always read what it actually says. This is just common sense. As we have repeated in our previous instructional videos, Justice Blackmun specifically stated that for the period of pregnancy prior to this compelling point, the attending physician, in consultation with his patient, is free to determine without regulation by the state that in his medical judgment, the patient's pregnancy should be terminated. He most specifically stated that if that decision is reached, the judgment may be effectuated by an abortion free of interference by the state. And he said, with respect to the state's important and legitimate interest in potential life, the compelling point is at viability. And for those who may have missed the point, summing it up at the end, Justice Blackmun stated, for the stage prior to approximately the end of the first trimester, The abortion decision and its effectuation, a term which we explained in one video, must be left to the medical judgment of the pregnant woman's attending physician. Is there any confusion there? The attending physician of the pregnant woman. And this makes common sense. If my mom has already botched the job of keeping social distance between her good friend Esther DH and Freddie the preppy spermatozoa in social distance, if she has failed to understand the whole conversation with her parents about the birds and the bees, and has some basic misconceptions about the whole conceptual undergirding of this thing we describe as science, perhaps thinking that one-ply cotton is impervious to microbial penetration. That is a matter that should, logically, reasonably, be decided by someone with more expertise, professional judgment, and who, shall we say, knows how to act like an adult and a reasonable person. Need I say more? But boys and girls, this segment is probably my favorite part because we have an opportunity to explore this concept of viability that Justice Blackmun found so determinative, particularly in delineating the dividing line between where the judgment of an attending physician, as we can see, the woman's choice is now outside of this discussion, the attending physician, and where the jurisdiction of the government commences. And so in our attempt to remain contemporary, we shall now have the opportunity with this living document to discuss that ever-interesting intellectual topic of the meaning of life, which was so important inside the conversation between the two adults in the decision of abortion, which for viruses, scientists conceive, remains a topic of philosophical debate. And in 2010, just about a decade ago, Patrick Faucher authored an article on this very topic that had appeared in the Origins of Life Evolution Biosphere Journal, a scientific journal, not quite Washingtonian magazine, in which he explored this truly fascinating topic in elevated discourse, which, sadly, we do not even find in our most educated municipalities like the county of Arlington, and even a race for the school board exam. Nonetheless, Mr. Faucher preferred the following proposition about viruses by commencing the discussion with the simple interrogatory, what is life? And he informs us that since 1944 in the field of virology, or study of viruses, this question was first proposed by Erwin Schrödinger and remains still debated and unresolved. In fact, most of which we even know about viruses which were first discovered at the end of the 19th century, 1892, 1898, two independent events. The century, as you recall from one of our previous videos, was when the germ theory of disease first began to take hold. 1832, we have the discovery of tuberculosis, a bacteria, a little bit larger than a virus. 1870, we have the development of Koch's postulates, working with anthrax to determine causation of bacteria, is actually only rather recent. And by that time, most that had been discovered had only evolved in the past 20 years. And we know now that within just the past 5 years or 6 years, even scientists engaged in dual-use research of concern, or DIRC, which may be classified work, were able to accomplish something that was considered entirely impossible by the National Academies for Science just a short decade ago. Cultivating a virus in vitro outside the body, like in a petri dish. And we can give a round of applause to the Wuhan Virology Institute and UNC Chapel Hill for announcing their success at this endeavor in 2015 with a SARS-like coronavirus. And had they only thought further ahead to what may have occurred had perhaps such a virus, as they say, escaped because of clumsy government scientists, perhaps science could have more quickly developed a safe and effective vaccine, unlike the present vaccine, which, while produced in record time, warp speed, has had quite a few reported problems with breakthrough infections and severe adverse events, even if some people believe that this is the end of the pandemic. We must make a note to address that in the after-action review after the pandemic. Boys and girls, proceeding on, some of our more advanced students may remember from perhaps high school, if you went to a good high school, that the electron microscope did not appear until 1932, just about 3 decades after the discovery of viruses. And it was around the same time that the first coronavirus, the largest in genome mass, in fact, amongst viruses, making them the most unstable and the largest class of viruses, providing them the optimum advantage for developing variant mutant strains of concern, were first discovered in animals, chickens in fact. Also just about 3 decades after the discovery of the first virus known to be harmful to mankind. In 1901, the virus that causes smallpox, that had been long a problem that science had not even near perfectly caused, resulting in great losses of life. And today, despite being the most abundant biological particles in the world, especially with the news of more virulent and transmissible descendant variants of concern for a novel coronavirus seemingly each month. Before the present evolving science had only found a total of 220 harmful to mankind. But suddenly science changed with one zoonotic evolution, we are told. And ignorance is not quite bliss in epidemiology, you see. But boys and girls, some may recall also from grammar school that cells are generally described as the building blocks of life. But it was not until 1953 that two gentlemen, James D. Watson and Francis Crick, discovered the helix structure within the cells that they decided to call deoxyribonucleic acid, which contain our genetic materials as living organisms. And some may have had some graphic models to pass around class and feel and touch in their grammar school classes so they could have a feel of science. Looking for chemistry? Especially for those who were less academically inclined, who kept confusing the genes that we wear with the genes in the genetic material. And probably a joke or two about designer genes. And some may have had someone who was convinced even more that the whole discussion was about his or her aunt gene. But that's why we have pandemics. But for those like the recent voyages aboard Inspiration 4, hoping to be the next members of the Federation of Planets, even with absolutely no astronaut training or ability to control the fully automated space capsule, may be interested to know that even real scientists have to consider the potential for extraterrestrial life beyond this planet in helping to develop a unified theory or operational definition that might be universally applied to describe that which is living and that which is not, no matter where in the universe it might be discovered. Since science is essentially the business of resolving anomalies to formulate constants and rules that can be utilized to make accurate predictions, something that we are still trying to figure out during a global public health crisis. And personally, not really convinced of the possibilities for anything other than carbon-based life. I am a big fan of Fortier's approach to this question on the meaning of life, because he is no nonsense, no emotional baggage, no crazy idealism. He simply follows that which is known. He does not care about your thoughts that animals or even plants are people too. However that goes in your head. He doesn't care about your thoughts that you have a destiny and were placed here for some greater purpose. According to Fortier, life is just firing neurons and biochemical activity, and the rest is only suggestions arising from your pride, vanity, self-preservation, and other psychological motivations that are scientific only to the extent that they exist in some form in your head, but are only ephemeral illusions. And he says, I will adopt here the view that up to now, life is only a terrestrial phenomenon. A characteristic of terrestrial living organisms In fact, there is no life without living organisms, and all presently known living organisms are thriving on planet Earth. If one day we hopefully meet friends from another world and not invading enemies, it will then be possible to define, he says, life in terms of the common properties shared by organisms from both or other planets. And his definition of life is framed in this manner: if life is being alive or having been alive when such objects are dead, then the consensus is science, at least for the first decade of the current century, was that since sciences were not always animated with functions like mobility, respiration, excretion, and most essentially reproduction, and only began to exhibit these qualities after a proper introduction to a living host so as to cause a state of infection or disease, they were not considered to be truly alive. But since that time, however, and this is interesting, intriguingly, not like a fetus, which is just a mass of cells and not life, according to some, viruses, mere strains of RNA, and sometimes DNA, that convert to RNA have become accepted by many scientists, more and more every day, as living organisms, just like plants, just like animals, just like human beings that are not fetuses, which biosphere food chain thinking may come as a surprise to some promoters of animal rights or those who have adopted vegetarian habits or feelings of egalitarianism because humans are just as equal as dogs. That was informative, at least for me. But that is all that we have time for right now, boys and girls, and I hope sincerely that this familiarization has assisted you in better understanding the concepts of infection and disease prevention. And in later installments for this educational video series, we shall continue to use the example of my mom and the very familiar and intriguing concept of pregnancy to explore further the topics of viability, the meaning of life, and some very basic counting methods, some of which you may already be familiar with in preventing the spread of infection, staying healthy, staying safe, staying alive, staying informed, and avoiding a visit to the hospital, because it's never good to be in the food chain of a single strand of RNA, like my mom who is having a novel coronavirus. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you next time. And just remember, in November, to keep Mike Webb away from our schools. It's Briefing It Unclassified. Prevention, as we often say, is the best medicine, and sometimes abstinence is not an option. And just remember that safety very often is a woman's choice. So stay at home. And come on, man, don't forget your dang mask.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike White.
Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.